In 313, when Constantine signed the Edict of Milan, it made Christianity a legal faith, which meant that it could be practiced out in the open. But for almost 300 years prior, the faith had to be practiced in secret. Many worshipers practiced in private homes. It was a space very similar to what we saw with the synagogue in Dura Europa, where a private residence would have a area for communal worship. It's just that with the Christians, this would be a very secretive and illegal practice. But it was by the time of the Edict of Milan, it had become common practice for the Christians to come together in a space to hear the teachings of Christ, of the New Testament. And so when this is now legal, they need to build buildings that can accommodate their way of worship, these large communal spaces. It doesn't. This Christian art and architecture is going to accelerate in production after the year 380, when the Roman Emperor Theodosius I decrees all pagan religions, all polytheistic faiths, to be illegal, and the private and public worship of gods and goddesses to be illegal. And we see government taking of the temples. That's when we start to see all of the looting and destruction that we've looked at so far in this class. Remember I said, oh, their faces, they were defaced, take away their power to take away their face. That starts to happen after, in the Roman Empire, after the empire makes worship of those other faiths illegal. At many of these sites, the temples are destroyed and reused in the construction of Christian temples. Many of these sites become Christian sites. So a temple dedicated to a god or goddess will not only be deconstructed, but then in its spot will be a Christian church or a Christian shrine. And this is a way for the government to fold in people to the state religion. It's a way of establishing authority over the large swath of the empire through their faith. Now, we're going to look at a couple of these early Christian churches, these areas or buildings of worship, and we're going to see how and why they were used and what function they served within the larger faith. The first is Old St. Peter's Basilica. And this is a drawing reconstruction because this current building is no longer, or the building is currently no longer there. This is based on archaeological record and people's descriptions of it. In its place is the new St. Peter's Basilica, but we don't talk about that one in this class. We are going to look at the old St. Peter's Basilica. So in the old St. Peter's Basilica, which was heavily funded by Constantine after the Edict of Milan, what we see is a gatehouse, a walled colonnaded courtyard or atrium. We walk through to a long rectangular building that has a clerestory of windows, a flat timber roof, and side aisles defined by those colonnades. This, if you're really into architecture and you've been paying attention, this structure should remind you of something that we saw already in class. Let me give you a moment to think of it. A gatehouse with a central open courtyard and a rectangular structure. Are you thinking of it? It's a forum. like the Forum of Trajan. There is a gatehouse, there is a colonnaded open courtyard or atrium, and then a rectangular basilica. That's the structure there. I gave you a hint. I said it right there. I said basilica. So the early Christians, they say, okay, you know what's not going to work for worship? A temple. Because a temple is a place for just a God. There's no room for anybody in there, right? It's just the space for the God and the few priests and priestesses. And that is not how Christianity works. That's not how Christians worship. They worship together in a space to hear the word of God. So, a basilica, a large space, is a much more accommodating space for their style of worship. So, the Forum of Trajan I like to show you as a kind of predecessor for early Christian churches. The difference being that in the early Christian churches, like St. Peter's, the basilica is switched to the short side. What do I mean by that? Like this. So we have our gatehouse, right? And our colonnaded courtyard. Now, rather than a long-sided entrance to a basilica, instead, what we start to see developing in early Christian, not all the time, but often, is that the entrance is on the short side, and the columns run this way. The apse is then at one end of the church. What this does is it allows for an unobstructed view into the apse where the Christian sacred altar would have been placed. The church we're looking at here, St. Peter's, was built over a sacred site for early Christians. It is built over the believed burial site of Peter. Peter, one of the apostles, one of the followers of Christ who brought the word to the city of Rome. He was killed for his teachings and buried at this site, and then the site for 300 years was this sacred kind of shrine, secret shrine to the man Peter. And then when the Edict of Milan happens, now they can worship openly. They build a church on top of his burial site. So that's why it's called St. Peter's Basilica, because of the basilica shape. Interesting, right? I know. Now, this goes in support of the way that the Christians worship because it allows for, a large space for everybody to come in and hear the word. It also is nothing like a temple. A forum is a non-threatening communal area in any Roman city, in any Roman town, and doesn't have with it those connotations of, gods and goddesses and temples. Let's look at a different view here. So this is a cross cutaway of the basilica, and you can see those two side aisles, the clerestory of windows, and then beyond and inside would be that half circle or the apse where the altar would have been placed. And again, it allows for this unobstructed view of the altar. So here, just to kind of reestablish the Forum of Trajan, a colonnaded open courtyard or atrium, and the basilica with those apses. You see that here. You flip it around, and you have your side aisles and your nave with an unobstructed view into the apse. I also want to call attention to another vocabulary word, narthex. Narthex. Here it is. Narthex. Narthex is the front porch or vestibule. It's the area where you enter into the sacred space. Generally, a narthex is covered and is outlined in columns or arches, so a colonnade or an arcade, and it's kind of like a front porch preceding the sacred space of the nave. Here. We've seen the narthex, I just didn't talk about it, but do you remember the Basilica Nova that Constantine took, and he flipped the entrance so that the entrance was on the short side, and he put his giant statue in the apse? Well, this area, this front porch, is a narthex. So what we are looking at is a connection to another forum. This one, the Basilica Nova, or so to say, another connection to another basilica. You have a narthex and a nave and an apse. A narthex, a nave, and an apse. These side elements that jut out from the aisles, they cross the nave, they trans or cross the nave. These are called transepts. They are these kind of side arms that can often be placed in a basilica. Think of a transept as offering additional floor space for communal worship. It serves a purpose of providing more sacred space. It also echoes another commonly associated image of the Christian faith. The transepts make the long rectilinear basilica kind of resemble a cross or a crucifix, which was by this time now used as a symbol of Christ on the crucifix. Oh, here you can't see it. Christ on the cross, which the cross was often used as the death penalty for treason, which Jesus was tried and found guilty of treason against the Romans. Okay, I'm so sorry. I know, I felt you go, whoa. Okay, so Jesus was crucified for treason, a very common practice, and the use of transepts helps to make a basilica resemble the cross, which by the year 300 has become a symbol of the Christian faith. Okay. The interior of St. Peter's Basilica was opulent. It was extravagant. And the reason? It was funded by Constantine. It, by all accounts, had these amazing bright frescoes painted with scenes from the life of Jesus, also from scenes from the Old Testament. There were elaborate mosaics on the exteriors, beautiful marble columns that had been confiscated from Roman pagan temples. It was furnished with rich tapestries and gold and silver candlesticks and goblets and pitchers and plates. It was meant to impress. It was meant to completely stand out as this jewel of heaven, which is what it promised to the people inside the space. Imagine walking into a sacred space, something that you would not be able to do for polytheistic faith. You're not allowed into that temple. And here you are allowed into this sacred space, and then you're just overwhelmed by the opulence and the majesty. And then think about it. Some of these columns came from those temples to the gods that you used to worship, or that your grandparents used to worship, or your great-great-great-grandparents used to worship. And what does that mean in terms of their power? They obviously don't have any more power. They've been superseded, reused in this new structure. It's a power dynamic going on here. Just as we saw with the Pantheon and those Egyptian pink and gray stones, those monolithic columns as a sign of power of the empire, to have this confiscated temple architecture inside of this basilica, which you can occupy, you can stand in, is a way of displaying the power of this new faith.